The video has been started.
Good afternoon. This is Elizabeth McCarty with the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. We are hosting a 5-part series this week on natural resource management in urban forests. Today's speaker is Chuck Bargeron. He leads the UGA Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health, and he'll be speaking on invasive species in urban forests. Please do join us again tomorrow for our last presentation, which will be on environmental education in urban forests. If you have questions during the presentation, please put those in the Q&A section that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen right next to the chat. If we get the questions in there, we'll be more likely to see them at the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for your attendance, and Chuck, it's all yours.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks everybody for joining us over your lunch hour if you're in Eastern time anyway. As Elizabeth said, I am the director of the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health. And so today I'm going to give an overview of some of the problems that we see in urban environments, and some overview of invasive species in general and the problems that they cause, and then some tools that I'm involved with that can be used to help manage and prevent problems with invasive species. So, and feel free to jump in with questions, and we can answer those either along the way or at the end. So the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health is a partnership between the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources and the College of Ag and Environmental Sciences at the University of Georgia. And we are primarily focused on public service and outreach, extension work, getting materials out to the general public. A lot of that work is focused primarily on invasive species, but we also do some work in integrated pest management and forest health. And a lot of what we do is tied to using different information technology tools, as well as building partnerships with groups and helping them solve problems that they have. And here's a picture of our group at UGA in Tifton. What is an invasive species? And this is a definition that if you Google, you'll probably find 5 different ways that different groups, including government agencies, will even document what give a definition to what an invasive species is. But on a basic level, what we're going to be talking about here today is an invasive species is something that is not native to the ecosystem that it's invading, and its introduction does or is likely to do economic, environmental, or harm to human health. And so, and I'm going to go through this a few times, but just because something is exotic, just because something is not native to an ecosystem, does not mean that it is an invasive species. But by definition, to be an invasive species, it must be something that is not native to that ecosystem. And so, everything that is exotic is not bad, and everything, and when we're talking about invasive species, that does imply that it is something that's not native. So why do we care? Why are we even talking about this today? And that really comes back to the fact, other than the economic impact, there is risk to some of our endangered and threatened species due to these invasive species. And the problem is, in a lot of cases, a lot bigger than what most people realize. In this example, there's 5,000 plants that have escaped in the U.S., and we only have 17,000 native plants in the U.S. And this isn't some old data, but it's some of the best data that we have in terms of the cost of invasive species. So even though it's not perfect, it's still the best work that's been done on what the annual cost of invasive species is. And as I go through and talk about some of these problems, I'm going to kind of break them up into these groups of insects and diseases, as well as plants, and then some of the wildlife issues as well. So so kind of keep that in mind. But as you can see, it's a good mix of split between the different groups. And one of the comparisons that when I talk about this and I'm doing kind of this overall invasive species presentation is to talk about the fact that, you know, in the 70s, there was a big push on issues with chemicals and concern over introducing chemicals to the environment. But these chemicals, they degrade over time. So with biological invasions, they multiply over time. They're in most cases getting worse over time. And so, you know, we need to think about that, because in a lot of cases we have to use chemicals to treat these species, and the payoff, the benefit of doing that with something that isn't going to degrade over time far exceeds the problem if we leave these species to themselves. I mentioned earlier that not all exotics are invasive. And it's important to remember that a lot of our food in the US is based on introduced species, as well as a lot of our landscaping and urban trees are introduced species. And so just because something is introduced, again, is not bad. So I wanted to give, when I'm talking about invasive species, I like to give the big scary stuff up front. And so I'm going to start off and talk about some of the wildlife problems. And some of these wildlife problems we're starting to see more and more in more urban environments. And so that's why I left this in when I was thinking about this from an urban standpoint. So first of all, if you were not aware, the wildlife trade is huge in the United States. Both the legal trade and the illegal trade is a huge annual in terms of funding. In terms of how much money goes into wildlife trade, pet trade, and other things in terms of moving species in. And so the problem is that those species can escape. Those species can be let loose into the environment. An aquarium can be dumped, et cetera, and those lead to what we're seeing with some of these problems. And so for the first example, I'm going to talk about the Burmese python. This picture was kind of the picture that brought Burmese python to the forefront. This was a picture taken by a National Park Service pilot in the Everglades. They saw something weird. They came down to investigate, and it's actually a python with the tail of an alligator coming out of it. And so, you know, this brought a lot of attention. This picture went viral at the time and started bringing attention to the python problem in Florida. And so, you know, for South Florida or for the rest of the country, well, why should we care? Well, other than the scary thing about a big snake and what they can do and all that kind of stuff, and you know, they are fairly large, can get fairly large. Here's one that was 18 foot long, and they can hide pretty well in the grass, as you can see in this picture. They reproduce very quickly, and the biggest thing is the impact to wildlife. And so here's one that was found, a 16-foot that was found with an adult deer, where it consumed an adult deer. And so what we're starting to see in the Everglades and in South Florida is a huge decrease in the native mammal populations. And this was just some examples of that. And that's due to the fact for these snakes to grow as large as they, you know, a 5 to 7 year old snake that's 13 foot long, this would be the hypothetical diet of what that snake would have to eat in order to get to be that size. And so, what we've seen over time is we're starting to see, as we've had some milder winters, we're starting to see these snakes move farther and farther north. They're still pretty contained to South Florida, but we've seen over the time we've been tracking this, and I'll talk about that in a few later, but how we're starting to see individuals pop up farther north, and that's where the concern really starts to come in. And here's the current distribution map. Is this part of the EdMap system that we run at UGA, and I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, and how you could become involved in that and help us document these things. But as you can see, the majority of the species have been found in the South Florida, in the Everglades region, but we are starting to see them pop up, and reports of them pop up farther north. Now, in a lot of cases, there's not been a documented breeding population farther north, or I think above Orlando at this point, but we are starting to see individual snakes that have been reported and documented in the farther northern parts of the state of Florida and into Georgia. Another species, and that in my mind is what the real scary species are, is the Nile monitor lizards. Those are another problem in South Florida. These can get up to be 6 foot long. They're kin to the Komodo dragons. So and I think I can handle a snake maybe more than I could handle this big lizard chasing after me. But those populations have continued to grow, even though there's some management going on in South Florida. And a similar species, the tegus, have established populations in Florida. And what we're starting to see is there's now documentation of these tegus in Georgia, in Southeast Georgia, and more recently, a population, or at least a lizard that was found in South Carolina. So I wanted to include this in here because this is where we're starting to see some of these reptiles that were initially just tied to Florida or South Florida starting to show up farther north, and can have huge impacts from there. A problem that is one of the species that across the U.S. everybody's really concerned about and really keeping an eye out for is the giant African snail. As you can see, that's somebody's hand holding the snail. There has been 2 different times, and they're about to wrap up the population in Miami now, but twice where this giant African snails have gotten established in the Miami area. And this is in an urban environment. They eat pretty much anything and everything, and they can carry the rat lungworm, which can cause meningitis in humans. So there is not only a landscape agricultural pest problem with these snails, as well as they can eat stucco on homes, which is even crazier. But there's also a public health problem with these snails. And again, these were something that, they think in most cases were brought in as something cool to have in your aquarium or terrarium. And then, hey, they got too expensive to feed. They got let loose, and enough of them got out there and started causing a problem. So just another thing I wanted to mention. This is one this was eradicated from Miami in the 60s, and then now has shown back up in around 2011, and they've been working on this population since then, and continue to mark different zones as eradicated. Okay, so moving on to some of the things that really can affect trees in our urban forest. I like to talk about the other things to kind of get your attention, and then let's talk about some of the tree problems quickly, and then some of the plants. But you know, a lot of times we don't think about some of these historical problems as invasive species, but Dutch elm disease and the cost to remove elm trees from Dutch elm disease, that's an invasive species, as well as the chestnut blight was an invasive species that took out a lot of our chestnut, almost all of our chestnut trees. And so, these are things that we've been living with for a long time now, that we've seen the impact to these species due to these invasives coming in. And so, and hemlock woolly adelgid would be another one that has been here for a while now and is really doing a lot of impact to our hemlock populations. So because of this, and because of looking at ways that pathways can really affect these species, and do some prevention, the Nature Conservancy, along with the Forest Service and a lot of state partners, has been working on this Don't Move Firewood campaign. And that is morphed into spinoffs where, it's buy it where you burn it. And it's really made, it's working to change that public attitude of, the Boy Scouts were leave no trace, and leave no trace is an outdoor, campaign. But one of the things the Boy Scouts always did was, you should, when you go camping somewhere, you should make it as good or better than what it was before you came, and not have a trace that you were there. And so that's one of the, having to change that mindset where, a lot of state parks and national parks are selling firewood now. So you don't have to bring firewood. If you're going camping across the country and you're in Michigan and you're going camping in Georgia, and you load up the back of your pickup truck with firewood, so you'll have it when you go camping and you get to your spot, and you may have just brought some different insects with you that we don't have in Georgia yet. And we, after some documented cases of things moving like that, that's where this is really taken hold, and is an important message to remember, because some of the current problems, emerald ash borer, which is a pest of ash trees, was first found in Michigan in 2002. It's this shiny metallic beetle. It primarily focuses on ash trees, and will wipe the trees out where they have to be removed. It's already killed over 25 million trees, and it's projected that as it continues to spread, it could be a national loss of $20 to $60 billion, because of the number of ash trees and the situation where these ash trees are, and the cost to remove them. And so just to understand the spread of this, so I think it was 2002 when it first came in. Here was kind of where the distribution was in 2011. You were starting to see it in Minnesota, Missouri, and down in Tennessee. And then you jump to now, and we've got it all the way down into Georgia, and there's populations all the way in Colorado and into Texas, and it's pretty widespread through Missouri and Iowa now. So, kind of looking at, over the past almost 20 years now, it's spread up into Canada and Ontario and Quebec as well. We have seen, just enormous spread of this. And even with a lot of regulations and quarantines, it's that spread has continued. And so something to definitely keep an eye out with any ash trees, especially outside the area. Another big tree pest is Asian longhorn beetle. The Asian longhorn beetle is a black, typically black and white, or a bluish color beetle. It prefers maple trees. It has been an interesting one because there's been populations that have jumped around. There was a population in Chicago, in New York, and in New Jersey. I think there was a population in Ohio as well. And recently it was found in South Carolina in a population that had actually been there for a little while. And so, it seems kind of it seems kind of random where it's popping up. But what's happening in these areas is, they're having to start over in terms of the trees, because if they had a line of trees that were planted, in a lot of cases the same species, and it just went down and would take the species out. So here's where it's shown up. As you can see, some of these are marked as green where it has been eradicated from that area. And then some of the other ones have been more recent detections where it has popped up, and they're currently doing what they can to remove the infested trees and remove trees around it to kind of keep it from spreading any farther. But yeah, it was a significant jump when the population in Hollywood, South Carolina showed up. Another one that I want to mention is laurel wilt, and laurel wilt is a disease that is spread by an ambrosia beetle. And this was something that showed up in along the coast of Georgia in 2002, and has quickly spread throughout the Southeast, all the way to Texas, and all the way to South Florida. They're really it mainly attacks red bay trees, but it attacks other things within the Luraceae family, and it also will impact avocados. And so there's a big concern with the avocados in both South Florida, and this spreading to Mexico and having impact there. One that showed up in Northeast Georgia in 2009, that everybody was really concerned about, and then the populations have really dropped. But this became both a potential ag pest, where we were seeing major impacts to soybeans, as well as, it was called kudzu bug. Interesting. So because it did, kudzu was one of its hosts. Also wisteria was one of its hosts, but then soybeans were a host, and it became as much of a nuisance insect as well, where it would just show up, and as you can see on this house, they look kind of like ladybugs, but they were brown and kind of had this square shape. Once you knew what one looked like, they were very easy to find. And here's, you can see some of the irritation that it can cause on people's skin. And this almost was the perfect model of spread. You can see it started around Athens and was found in a lot of places around Athens, Georgia, and then just very quickly the population spread out. But then as we look at this, we have not seen, in a lot of cases, there's been years since the last report of this species. And so luckily it did not get to some of the larger soybean growing areas, and that really made it nice. Probably the biggest concern right now, and just not knowing what the impact will be, is spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly is this moth that you can see right here. It will impact grapes. It'll impact maples, walnut, a whole list of species. and you're seeing very large populations of them in the areas that it has been found. One of the interesting things with spotted lanternfly is that it seems to need tree of heaven to reproduce, which is an invasive tree. And so I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but it is an interesting relationship of this insect that can have major impact on both fruits as well as our trees. But it couldn't, as far as we know so far, it couldn't survive without this other species, tree of heaven, which is also an invasive. And so that is where having information on where tree of heaven is gives us a good place to start in terms of where to look for spotted lanternfly. And so here's the most updated distribution maps. As you can see, those kind of blue counties around Pennsylvania, Maryland, and into New York are where, there's infestation is present. But then as you can see, the kind of purple dots spread out show where the individual finds of the species have shown up. So definitely something to keep our eyes on, keep a lookout for. If I can go back really quickly, it is a fairly distinctive looking insect. And so it is something that having the public and having folks looking for and making sure that they report either through the EdMap system that I'm going to talk about in a second, or just to their local county agent when they do find something is very important, especially if you're near the infected area. And so here is the distribution of the known distribution of tree of heaven in the United States. So as you can see, in the darker green is kind of where it's more dense or known to be more dense, but it is pretty widespread and will provide a pretty good host range for that species if it continues to expand. This is one that I think is a very interesting species, so I included it in here. It's called Tawny crazy ant. And as you can see in this picture right here, everything you see in that reddish brown color are the ants, and they're called crazy ants because they just kind of run around and all over the place. So a really interesting species, and we're starting to see it along the coast and in Florida. And so definitely a little bit different from folks in the South that are familiar with fire ants, just because of the mass and the numbers that will show up. So in thinking about this presentation and threats to urban forest, one of the biggest is invasive plant and invasive plant issues. And that's because those are the things that we end up planting, in our landscaping, and then, they spread, and that's how we've gotten some of these problems, and that's how these problems, continue. And so, it is, something that we can joke about and put together cute cartoons in terms of, kudzu growing and taking over the folks. But in reality, there's a lot of these species that are really problematic, and we choose them because, for different reasons, because they're attractive, because they're easy to grow, and we plant them in our landscapes. And then they get into our forests, they get into our natural areas, and they just take over everything else and form this monoculture that becomes very difficult to control. And so I just wanted to show some examples. Here's tree of heaven under power lines, Japanese honeysuckle taking over an old home site, and a huge patch of bamboo The Chinese privet that's planted around UGA Stadium, and then the other, kudzu growing into one of our national forests. And so, again, I'm not saying that, we can't have exotic plants and we don't need to just, focus on natives, but we just need to be careful and understand that, everything that's a weed is not necessarily an invasive species. We do have native weeds that cause problems in agriculture and cause problems in our landscapes as well. But it's really these invasive species, and there are different ways they've come in. Some of them came in accidentally, through packing materials, through crops, through landscape plants that were brought in that had them. Others were, and this is what I want us to think about in this is, they were planted for ornamental reasons, and we're starting to see how some of these, that were planted years ago are now starting to be problematic. And this is a good example of, not to scare everybody off in terms of these species, but this is kind of a general rule when they've looked at in introductions, with how many plants were introduced, how many actually escaped, how many escaped and became naturalized, and then how many really became an invasive problem. But what we're also seeing is that we know where some of these invasive species, there is this curve where there's a lag phase, and the populations get up to a certain point, and then that's when we kind of see the explosion. And so what the focus in that case is to do something with these as we start to see them escape and as we start to see them being a problem. And it's interesting when you look at something like the spread of Chinese privet in the South, in terms of number of counties infested, how much it really follows that curve. And, just to kind of repeat this and really press this is, the same features that we want in ornamental plants are the same things that make them be likely invasives. If they're, and the concept of carefree on this and the ornamentals is really a term I like in terms of talking about this, because we want to go to Lowe's or Home Depot or our local nursery and buy something that we can plant in our yard, and it'll grow fast and it'll be pretty and it'll attract birds and not get diseases and die, so we don't have to do something about it. And all of that is really what makes or what makes something to be a likely invasive species. And we can joke about these ads like this, but how many of these too good to be true in a lot of different ways, are, hey, it's going to grow 50 feet high in 1 year, and et cetera, et cetera. And an ad for Polonia, which now is very well documented to be a problem. And where are these species coming from? It's very easy to look at the world climate zone and match up whether it is Europe or Asia, and see how okay, the reason we have a lot of species that are called Chinese or Japanese in the U.S. is because of the climate being similar to those areas of the world. So looking at some of the species, specifically in Georgia that are problematic, and this is something that the Georgia Forestry Commission puts together every 2 years with some of the top species: privet, stiltgrass, chinaberry, kudzu, tallow tree, climbing fern, English ivy, which is still very much a ornamental species that's planted a lot, and then Kogon grass as well. But over time they've looked at, okay, let's take the main species and estimate the acreage across the Southeast, and it's estimated that about 18 million acres are covered by the primary 33 species that are problems in forested areas in the South, and that's about 9% of the forested acres. And so to highlight a few of those, tallow tree usually likes more wetter environments, but this is also called popcorn tree by some folks, but you can really recognize it by its leaf shape. Climbing fern, there's a couple of different ones of these, but climbing fern is, climbs up. It has this very distinct fern-like appearance. It can be very problematic in terms of being a fire hazard and being something that, fire gets on and very easily climbs up the trees. And where it really can be a problem is in contaminating the other things. So whether it's pine straw and contaminating pine straw and getting spread by pine straw, or in this case, some dirt that was moved in from, sold in bags to kind of fill in. And in this case, climbing fern was growing out of the top of the package. Luckily, me and one of my colleagues saw this and alerted the local store of the problem, and they were able to dispose of it. And so, but how, if we hadn't happened in this case, run into this, how would that have gone on to spread? And Kogon grass, which is a major forest problem in the South. I left this in there because it's a very interesting story when in talking about invasives. And so it is something that invades roadsides, invades forest. It does occasionally show up in more urban environments. It is, again, a huge fire hazard, as well as smoke hazard. And we've seen some good examples of that. And unlike some of the previous species that I've highlighted, with this one, what I really wanted to highlight is it's not its spread over time, but the documentation of where it is over time, specifically in Georgia. And so what happened with this species is in about 2006, around this time, a group said, okay, let's really focus on Kogon grass in Georgia, and let's see what we can do to keep it from becoming the problem in Georgia that we knew it was in Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. And so, over time, from that, 6 years later, okay, well, Chuck, it went from 60 sites to 614 sites, but this was not about as much about spread as it was about education. It became part of anybody who was working in a forest arena, part of the educational program that they would do. And so more and more landowners became aware of this. And because of that, yes, over this time period, it spread. But what was able to happen is the Forestry Commission, working with the U.S. Forest Service, was able to get in and treat these populations, more awareness, more knowledge of where it was, and ultimately able to really decrease, keep the level of new documentation of spots going, but ultimately be able to show some success. And this is a recent map showing where, in this case, 84% of all those known populations were negative, and some of them, 900 of the 1,300 have actually been completely eradicated. So, a story of how education, how educating the public and educating professionals on a problem can really lead to great success and keep this from being some of the issues it has been in other areas. And that was done through education, educational materials, and then, luckily being able to, the Forestry Commission being able to do that, that control of the species on private lands. So I wanted to wrap this up with a couple of different tools, and one of which was put together a long time ago by a group, and they're kind of like key points to remember when you're thinking about invasive plants, especially. And so I wanted to highlight those quickly. The first of all is to know what plants are a problem, know what a problem in your area is, and avoid those plants. Use non-invasive alternatives for the invasive plants. Watch out for hitchhikers, whether it's on an aquatic standpoint or on your clothes or on your animal even. Watch out for seeds being carried. There's a great campaign that is Play Clean Go, and that with the concept of making sure that you clean up your equipment, your stuff when you finish in a recreational area. When you do share plants, and a lot of gardeners will share plants, don't share the invasive ones, share the native ones, and that'll be a whole lot better situation, and keep you from being part of the problem. Try to find seed mixes that are weed or invasive plant free. You also can start seeing weed-free soil and mulch in some places and using that. Being more careful, especially with some of the aquatic plants. One of the cover story on Science Magazine recently was about a toxin that was responsible for killing a lot of bald eagles, and that toxin was found on hydrilla, and which is a invasive plant that in a lot of cases were used in aquariums. If you do have your favorite plant, your favorite tree that is something that's problematic, make sure you keep an eye out for new sprouts. And then when you do remove these, be careful to make sure they're removed correctly. And then finally, just kind of that same concept, be responsible with what you have. And so, very interesting, just some simple best management practices when you're talking about invasive plants. And we have some resources that we developed through the center here at the University of Georgia, one of which is invasive.org, that is really a clearinghouse of information and pictures related to invasive species. There are 65,000 pictures on that website, covering about 3,500 different species that are problems somewhere in North America, as well as a lot of information about those species. So that's a great resource to bookmark. And another project that we have is called EdMaps. And what we do with EdMaps is we use it to document and track different invasive species. And so using the EdMaps tools and their smartphone apps, as well as website reporting for all taxa, it gives there's the concept of, if you see something, say something, and that very much applies to the invasive species world. And so, if you see a tree that maybe has some new insect on it or is dying and you hadn't really noticed it and it looks different, here's a way you can document that. The reports are routed to the appropriate experts in your state or county, and if it is something new or something that there needs to be an early detection rapid response to, then that happens. And so that, like I said, can be done using the website. There's networks across the country working on this. And we've recently integrated a lot of our tools into one standalone EdMaps app where you can choose your state and then make those reports within that app. And, you know, we're starting, as EdMaps has recently completely expanded into Canada. And so we're starting to be able to see maps of these species, both of the US and into Canada. And then, like I mentioned with Tree of Heaven, here's the point distribution map of Tree of Heaven, where you can see where the different populations are. And we've been working with the Morton Arboretum in Chicago, and they are going to use, they've spent the last couple of years documenting where Tree of Heaven is in Illinois. And now they're going to use those points for those Tree of Heaven populations to go back and do monitoring for spotted lanternfly. So it's where, you know, documenting these invasive plants, documenting these invasive species, years down the road, you never know exactly what, how that data can be used and help with something new like spotted lanternfly. So we've built in ways for them to use the app tools to go in and say, hey, is Tree of Heaven still there? And while you're looking, did you see spotted lanternfly? And so in the next few minutes, as I wrap up, I wanted to bring up another project that that we're involved in, that the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Service are really the leads on. And that's a project called Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities. And so about 10 years ago now, the concept of Google was experimenting, and there was pros and cons to their experiment of people searching for flu symptoms and being able to kind of track flu based on what people were doing with searching Google for symptoms of the flu. And so that concept was kind of taken and said, okay, well, what if you were tracking the health of trees across a large landscape? Then what would you be able to learn from that data? So that's how the Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities initiative began. So it started in 2014 with the concept of this tree health monitoring and pest detection, as well as just promoting stewardship and monitoring. So it starts with the smartphone app, the Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities smartphone app, as well as a project-based dashboard and a lot of educational and training resources that have been done. And then all this data, there's different groups working on it. There was some pilot projects. Here's what the app looks like. You kind of go in and you say, okay, well, you can add your tree, or in some cases, there's existing trees in the database. And then you can go through and say, okay, well, I watered this tree today, or I'm doing this health check on the tree. And so there's different metrics that you can enter, and then that helps come back with the health score of the tree. And so, you know, the hope of this project is as this expands, then, you know, you'll start being able to look across a larger landscape at, you know, at different species and how the health is going. And okay, well, maybe we're starting to see in Atlanta a lot of pear trees that are you know, their health has declined over the last year. And so, you know, hey, should we be looking into that and seeing if there's something going on or a new possible problem with pear trees? So really neat project, really something that would be worth checking out. There's some really good videos explaining both the app and the different metrics that are used for tree health checking, as well as things like calculating DBH of a tree, that are all available if you search for Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities on YouTube. And so we're currently in the process of updating the web-based project management dashboard and expanding that so different cities and different groups can use it as a way for working with volunteers to monitor the health of trees, in different urban environments. And so, here are just some examples of how some of this works and the different classes and rankings for different things. And so there's been some very successful citizen science projects with different groups, whether it be Boy Scouts or interns with the Nature Conservancy, really doing some cool things and even showing how properly trained volunteers data is not too far off from what experts are doing. So, and here was just somewhere some of the pilot cities for this have happened. So, there's been a lot of efforts with tree planting, and this project is really trying to work with those different tree planting projects to get the data, share the data, and use it for predicting issues with trees. So and I think there's a lot that both from the reporting invasive species standpoint and looking at ways with something like Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities that we can better use our community scientists, citizen scientists to work on that. So I wanted to leave you. Invasive species are definitely an issue that are here to stay, and something that needs to be more of a public issue. The see something, say something concept, the Asian giant hornet, the murder hornet that there was so much news about this time last year. That was a concerned citizen that saw a large hornet and reported it, and they were able to quickly do something about it. And, be careful, because we never know what the next thing, Bradford pear in this case, and then how widespread, we can see a species like that start to spread and really become a problem. You never know what the next snake hiding in the grass is. So with that, I will stop, and I think we've got a little bit of time for questions.
All right, Chuck, I'll read some questions off to you unless you want to handle it.
Yes, I'll let you do it because I can't seem to find them. Maybe if I stop sharing, then I'll.
Any national or regional efforts to restrict sale of invasive plants such as English ivy?
Because that is a so yes, there are some efforts to do that, but it varies on a state by state level. There's really nothing nationally in terms of national effort to ban species.
All right. Is autumn olive a disruptive invasive?
Yes, so autumn olive has been well documented in the Southeast as a problematic, southern as one of the worst invaders for forest in the South.
Is anybody working on research focused on controlling autumn olive that is growing everywhere in East Tennessee?
I'm not sure of anything that is currently going on autumn olive. There are some resources out there with some good control information on autumn olive that was done as part of the work by Jim Miller with the U.S. Forest Service about 10 years ago, and there's good proven prescriptions for control.
All right. What is the most effective approach to remove Japanese stiltgrass, or can you instead point us to a resource to see?
Yeah, again, I would tell you to go to, audio is going crazy. To look at the work that was done by Jim Miller at the Forest Service. There's some really good, there's a publication that's got detailed management guidelines for automotive and Japanese grass. That unless there may be something more recent, but that has been, I know there was a lot of work and effort that went into that publication, and that is what a lot of folks are using on the control standpoint.
All right, and I will share the pillar book link on Bugwood in the chat in just a minute.
Yeah, that would be great.
NRCS payment incentives available to help with woody invasive removal of private forest in the United States, including olive. Okay, somebody asked that. Okay, is multiflora rose in Georgia?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly how widespread it is in Georgia, but there are definitely some populations of multiflora rose in Georgia. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen it in Georgia. I'm not sure that I have, but I know it's been found probably more in the Piedmont and northern part of the state.
And if y'all will look in the chat, the most recent chat is a direct link to a PDF of the Miller book on Bugwood. So if we can leave, even once we're finished, leave this open for about 5 minutes so people can have a chance to access that link.
Yeah, and that was done with Jim Miller and Steve Manning, who runs an invasive plant control company, and Stephen Enlow, who was a weed scientist at Auburn and is now at University of Florida. And that is the most comprehensive publication for the southern region anyway for invasive plant control.
Great. I don't see that we have any questions right now. Let me double check. Okay. If anyone on the call or you know of tribal departments interested in or who have issues and need outreach on invasive species threatening their natural resources, I have a USDA APHIS project that will fund building outreach materials with their logos, et cetera, to raise awareness and identification of invasives at no cost. So this is Dan Baggerly at WSU.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much for joining us, and don't forget about the webinar tomorrow on environmental education.
Yes, thank you for your time, and y'all have a great afternoon.
I'm going to shut off the recording now.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Ingvar. Have a great afternoon.
You're welcome. You too. Thank you.